All right, so thank you everyone for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce you today to our guest speaker, Dr. Kartikeya Singh, he has a very illustrious set of accomplishments, so I'm going to read from my notes here. So he is actually coming to us from CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He is the Deputy Director of the Wardhwani Chair in U.S. India Policy Studies there. And his research interests include climate change and energy policy, innovation, and the geopolitics of energy use. His work is very interdisciplinary, as we've been talking about recently, and among other things, his work has allowed him to field test and deploy clean energy technologies, including electric vehicles and off-grid solar solutions in both India and Uganda. From 2009 to 2012, he served as an advisor and negotiator on behalf of the Republic of Maldives at the UN FCCC, focusing on mitigation and technology transfer. Prior to joining the CSIS, he was actually at the U.S. Department of Energy, supporting and managing U.S. India and U.S. Pakistan bilateral energy cooperation. He received his Ph.D. from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and he has also been the recipient of a number of national awards, including the Morris K. Udall Scholarship and the Boren Fellowship. So today he's going to be talking to us about sun gods and solar energy, he'll give some remarks, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So without further delay, thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. You should feel free to ask any questions even throughout the talk, if that's okay.
Sure.
I'm going to kind of lead you through a little bit of, I'm going to try and weave a narrative here of my own journey since having graduated from college and where I am right now, and the sort of different kinds of projects I've been affiliated with, and they kind of span this climate, energy nexus, the sort of testing these technologies in the field level, and where I am now, which is really trying to foster sub-national partnerships between the two countries. And I'll start out sort of, and I know that the class is on environmental politics, correct? And this is Energy Week. So hopefully many of the different points that I'll bring in will resonate with some of what you're reading. Sun gods, in particular, I've sort of named this talk that way. There was an article that I wrote that came out earlier this year. Surya is the god of the sun in Hindu mythology, and my own fieldwork was in the diffusion of off-grid solar technologies in India very specifically. And so it wasn't until kind of I was leaving the airport in New Delhi after having spent a whole year doing my fieldwork that in the airport terminal, I noticed that there was this, I'd always noticed that there was this massive bronze statue. I went up to read the plaque, and it was for Surya, his sun god. And so I was like, all right, well, this is a sign that I can go back and finish my dissertation. Everything will be good. But if you've ever been to India, I feel like there's a very strong spiritual thread that runs across any sort of work that you want to do. And I found myself in some really remote places doing a little bit of soul searching, if you will, while I was doing my field work. So let's start with a little bit of background on India on the global climate stage. So it's been about a decade since I graduated from Furman University, where I was an undergraduate studying ecology. And at that time, I got a fellowship to go to India to work on helping draft sort of climate and energy policy. And I found my home at an institution called the Center for Science and Environment in New Delhi. And my mentor for this fellowship that I'd gotten was Sunita Narayan, who's the director of that center. And if you don't know, and these are sort of comic strips that they came up with, they have been they've had the ear of the Indian government since the 80s in essentially guiding their climate policy. So in the 80s, there was a report that was released by a US think tank that tried to point the finger of blame on climate change perpetrators, if you will, squarely at India and China because of methane emissions. So if you look at a country like China, which had, at that time, incredible sort of rice paddy cultivation and the methane that sort of arises from that, and India, which has a historically large population of cows, you have lots of methane generated there as well. So their argument was that methane is a longer-lived climate pollutant, and therefore we need to address this particular aspect of the climate problem, and we should put more pressure on India and China. Of course, a think tank like the Center for Science and Environment would then be able to swoop in and craft this narrative of not having the right space to be able to develop. Even now, approximately 300 million people do not have access to reliable electricity in India, and at that time it was even more. So to ask a country like India to curb its access to cheap, polluting energy to be able to lift livelihoods was just not an option. And of course, then India had this approach in the international climate negotiations of us versus them. Like here's a classic example, the carbon cake, if you will. If there's a finite amount of carbon that we can emit until we really go off the rails in terms of runaway climate change, certainly more of that cake should be left over for countries like India and probably not so much China anymore, but other parts of the developing countries. But India's remained sort of committed to this process of the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, as the mechanism to be able to hash out solutions to this. But for quite a long time, it was an us versus them and our right to grow attitude. And it was sort of driven by India's triple challenge, that it needed to build out its energy landscape, its infrastructure. It needed to provide access to connectivity to the last mile consumer. And it needed to do so while trying to mitigate for at least air pollution, if not climate change. So you probably heard a lot in the news recently that New Delhi sort of vies for the top spot with Beijing and China for air pollution. So this is India's triple challenge in trying to do all of this then and even now, and it's sort of taken on a new level of urgency as India's ecological security is threatened. So too are its ambitions to become an economic powerhouse, because the ecosystems that you need to be healthy and thriving for human development and economic growth are threatened by having an unstable environment and global climate system. So I got to India and I thought I would design, I would work on climate energy, but my mentor told me that you couldn't work on climate in India until you really unpack the issue of energy poverty. And so she told me to focus on people living in rural and remote areas, and I was asked to design a survey that would look at impacts of access to certain technologies, renewable energy technologies in particular, that these folks could use, and their impacts on their livelihoods, their health, their education, and overall productivity of the home. And I basically went around door to door collecting this information. I thought I would have access to somebody who would do the question. I've been out of the country for quite some time, lost a lot of language skills, and I translated this survey in Hindi, so I thought somebody would be with me to do the asking of questions. Turns out there was nobody to help me, so very quickly I had to pick up very technical Hindi language skills regarding solar and knowing how to ask about climate change and things like that. And it was a really enriching experience. And in that process, I actually dug up information about my own family background. So this is actually my ancestral home in the northwestern state of Rajasthan, which borders Pakistan. It's a largely desert state, although you can't tell by looking at this, aside from the acacia trees, because this is crop growing season. My grandfather paid to have the extensions for electricity to his home, to have the extensions be extended to the home in the 70s. He passed away in the early 80s, and we received electricity access finally a few years ago. This is the story of sort of electrification and energy access in India. It's no surprise then that when technologies became cheaper, particularly in the solar space, when business models improved, that communities like this sought solutions like off-grid solar technologies, which is what I ultimately ended up studying. So anyway, it became very close to home as far as the challenge and being very close to the people who are sort of dealing with this issue on a day-to-day, and it tells the story more broadly for India. So the technology I really started to try to unpack was the solar home lighting systems, just so you have a sense of what it looks like. And some of you may have come across this before. So there's a basic solar panel, some LED bulbs, there's an inverter, it can charge cell phones, there's a battery pack that's not here, and that's kind of the technology that I was looking at. These solutions had started cropping up. While I was in India, I also had the chance to attend the UN climate negotiations, which were happening that year in Bali, Indonesia. The reason they were important was because it was the year that the world was going to come together and try to figure out what the post-Kyoto Protocol framework would look like. We'd had enacted Kyoto Protocol, it had been ratified in many countries, not in the US, Canada, and Australia at that time. And because those countries were not a part of it, and India and China developed to a point where their emissions would have an impact that they needed to be held responsible, there was a call for beyond Kyoto Protocol framework. In that space, I realized that there is this issue of intergenerational equity in climate change as well. We talk about equity among nations, rich and poor, and the capacity to pay for those mitigation measures, but it's the young people who ultimately are not at the decision-making table, but will eventually live out the impacts of climate change. Yet young people had no space to actually voice their concerns in that process. So I found out that I was the only sort of Indian American youth representative, and I went with this institution called the Sustain Us. So you should check it out. It's the U.S. Youth Network for Sustainable Development, a bunch of young policy wonks. That's how I managed to get into the conference. Anyway, long story short, I went back to India, and instead of continuing down the path of sort of doing this research on energy access, started an institution called the Indian Youth Climate Network. At that time, choosing those words, India, youth, climate, meant that the whole world wanted to sort of come in and try to find a way to partner with you or to see what you were up to, because we were trying to weave a narrative of an India that could lead on climate change, which was very difficult to do when civil society was very much lock in step with the central government on an India that could not lead, that needed to sort of sit on the sidelines and get access to resources to be able to mitigate for climate change. So we were trying to create a narrative that was much more forward-leaning, that the innovation capacity was there in the country. And one of the ways we did it was a crazy electric car journey from the South Indian city of Chennai to New Delhi. This took about 40 days, and we had to do considerable planning in advance. We had some prototype vehicles from a company called Reva, which was subsequently bought by Mahindra, which is a pretty global company that right after that, it was probably a big, it ended up being sort of a publicity campaign for Reva, which then made them more attractive, I think, to be acquired. But we were a traveling circus, essentially. We went from city to city, from some of the villages, to have a conversation with business leaders about what it means for business to act on climate in India, what it meant for universities to think about institutional sustainability, and what it meant for municipalities and for state governments. And just to give you a sense of what the vehicles look like, they're here. We even had a gentleman on the far left here that had a vehicle. He was from the Czech Republic. He had driven from the Czech Republic to India in a waste vegetable oil powered vehicle. So we sort of adopted him in our caravan. We had another biofuel vehicle as part of the caravan and a solar powered rock band, because of course that's one way you resonate with the masses. They're from upstate New York, but they managed to learn some songs in Hindi, which was great. It was a big hit. Next thing you know, we were on MTV and at the president's house and everything. Anyway, it made a huge impact, and I think was a little bit of the turning point in trying to showcase that this indigenous technology produced in India could show that a country like India could take leadership in innovation. I was ultimately pulled back to grad school and started to look at energy access technologies again. And this time, I wanted to sort of approach, try to find out what are the disconnects in terms of technology, thought process behind technology innovation and actual deployment. And one classic case is biomass energy. Cook stoves have been sexy time and again in the development world as a means to improve indoor air quality and health. Essentially the idea is that you create a more efficient technology to burn biomass resources, and you can improve people's health and reduce particulate emissions, which can impact glacier melt and things like that. And these things are designed in labs here in the United States and other parts of the world. And I found that there was an incredible disconnect. You could go into homes and find these stoves just sitting on the side, and people going back to using their traditional three-stone firewood, three-stone cook stove, which was more inefficient. And I think one of the problems is that when these technologies are designed, there's often a disconnect between how people use these technologies. So in one of the internships that I had, I remember having to design a separate questionnaire that the firm hadn't thought of that would account for the amount of time that people took to cook certain foods, what foods they were cooking, what kinds of utensils they were using. I mean, very basic things. And of course, first and foremost, the fact that when they switch to this technology, they don't have to purchase the cooking fuel as opposed to having free biofuel that they collect from the fields and things like that. So dove back into the energy access space and also back into the UN, this time with the Maldives. I happened to get, again, another gig, which turned into a long-term gig with the Republic of Maldives, which is a small island nation in the Indian Ocean, not far from India. And it had actually sort of captured the imagination on the global stage when the democratically elected President Mohammed Nasheed had this underwater cabinet meeting that he held. It was widely televised, and the idea was that small island nations like this stand to lose big time as a result of inaction at the global stage in the climate negotiations. So I started to get a deeper insight into what it means to be at the very front lines of the climate debate, and then try to act on their behalf in the UN Framework Convention, which is quite a complex process. So what most people don't know is the UN climate negotiations, the way they were designed was really, if you didn't have a large enough delegation, you couldn't cover all the meetings. They would go on late into the night. If you had to go to the bathroom, whatever you had in a text could be lost if you weren't there to sort of guard it religiously. So at a really under-resourced capacity for a poor country, made it really difficult for them to actively participate in that process. So that year in 2010 was a big negotiation in Copenhagen when the world was supposed to announce a new framework, post-Kyoto framework. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. What we got was Copenhagen Accord, which, last-minute wheelings and dealings ultimately led to a pledge by a handful of most emitting countries that wouldn't get us to a place where we would be safe enough in terms of the global emissions of carbon to keep the temperature below 2 degrees increase. So that was an interesting insight into what it means for a small island state to participate in that process. But at the same time, what I was starting to see was that there was a disconnect between the amount of energy needed to bring a whole 1.6 billion stakeholder of the planet, of citizens, to connect them to electricity, and at the same time try to address the climate issue. And I decided to continue to focus on energy access for my dissertation work. And the UN announced this whole Sustainable Energy for All initiative, which is going to try to attempt to get universal access to energy for every home, and improve energy efficiency and double renewable energy deployment. But what I wanted to be mindful of was that the technologies that we deploy ultimately shouldn't lock people into a new type of energy poverty. It's not enough, I think, to just give people a solar lantern or give them a cook stove, because that doesn't allow you, I think the theory is that there's a step ladder, but really we need to make sure that people have access to the kinds of energy resources they need to be truly productive and to thrive as communities, not just barely survive. So being mindful of that, I tried to very objectively look at what factors were affecting the ability of solar firms for rural India to achieve scale. And what was interesting at this time in 2014, so we're talking 7 years on, there was a new government in India. Prime Minister Modi came into office in May of 2014. He took the previous administration's targets for solar, which was something like 20 gigawatts by 2022, and changed them to 100 gigawatts by 2022. In addition, he added another 75 gigawatts of other renewable energy sources to be added into the grid by 2022, and there were more such missions that were being rolled out. So there was a political mindset change in India at that time, shooting for the moon, essentially, in terms of trying to take the leadership on climate change, or at least not be seen as being not as pragmatic in their approach. And so with that in mind, it was also an interesting time to go around the country and explore what was happening with solar. So I found myself often in these kinds of scenarios trying to get to these remote areas, and I thought it'd be fun to document, so that's why I'm sharing that with you right now. Often going into really remote areas, canals being crossed, or sort of delta ecosystems, and of course my favorite mode of transport, rail. What I found, and now the next few slides will be rather technical, so I'll try not to get too bogged down in them and try to explain it more effectively. But let's start with what was happening with solar at that time in India. So what we're seeing here, and we're going to look at sort of business models that were emerging, just as clarification. So this is a place in Rajasthan called Barefoot College. What they do is essentially train, and this image is not representative because some of the women look quite young, but the idea is that they train illiterate grandmothers how to, from the scratch, design entire solar home lighting systems. I mean like circuitry, the tools that you would use, including the soldering tools, to be able to put together these systems, and that they're deployed back in their communities to essentially install and maintain these systems. So this place was really unique, and I got to get my hands dirty and actually design a circuitry board for a CFL portion of the solar home lighting system. Here, we have a woman who, actually there's somebody from Terry, who, as part of one of the institution's efforts to deploy energy access technologies, they had a campaign called Light a Billion Lives, and the idea was there was a charging rental system for access to solar lanterns in this case. So this woman, essentially for like less than a penny a day, or maybe a penny a day, would loan out these solar lanterns for people in her community to use and return. So that's a different business model, and she got some level of technical training to be able to do some repair work on this as well. And she had access to a loan from her community self-help group is the only way I can sort of design it, sort of a collective that pulls money together and then decides who to lend it out to, and they have a certain amount of time to pay that money back. So she had access to that resource to be able to buy the inventory. So that was another really interesting model. The other interesting thing I found in my travels was that there are gentlemen like this who are not super, they didn't get beyond 8th grade, but they may be technically trained as electrical technicians. And they are embedded in these villages, and they are essentially, they're moved beyond selling light bulbs and fans to actually creating solar home lighting systems and creating business models. And what's interesting about individuals like this is that they are locally embedded. They're not going to run off somewhere else. They're doing a lot of their business in cash. There's no sort of mini lending that's going on, which throws up another really interesting research question, which is, do we understand how poor people pay for things, or do we understand how they save for things? Maybe not as well as we thought we did, or how they made these purchasing decisions. So really important segment of people to capture and to study. I also found more sort of gleaming examples of these showrooms where you could go in and purchase these systems, where there was a franchisee network where one company could sort of choose to allow entrepreneurs to use their brand to purchase these technologies and use their supply chain network. It all come back to sort of looking at what are the, again, supply chain networks are a big part of critical need for the thriving, for a solar industry in India to thrive. But the fact that it was happening in sort of all manner of ways that would seem inconceivable for a lot of the industry that's based here for sure, but sort of throws up some interesting questions about how to do business in India for this last mile customer. And then other interesting research questions. So this is a gentleman who has a microgrid in a region of India that's sort of borders Bangladesh. It's called the Sundarbans. So it's the world's largest mangrove ecosystem. And it's very hard to get to. It's really hard to provide electricity access via the grid to these regions. So it's a thriving ecosystem full of these off-grid solar systems. So this gentleman is a relatively wealthier individual from this village, and he decided to take a loan out to put together a solar microgrid for his, I think, 30 households in his community. And he gave me all the reasons for why he was doing it. It made business sense. I wanted to interview his customers, and he was not happy with that. And the next day, as I was sort of waiting to cross the canal to go to another island, I had a couple extra hours, and I decided to ask some of his customers questions just to figure out what was going on. And this is by no means what was exactly happening or representative of what could happen. I can't sort of say that it is a major issue, but the few customers that I did speak to provided wildly different accounts of what they were being charged for the same level of service. So when you look at a society like India, where there are deep sort of divisions along caste lines, along religion, when we establish or deploy technologies like this, which are critical, but have no mechanism to police them, it throws up some really interesting question about how we're creating new power monopolies in these environments, and how do we control those, if at all. Another example was a microgrid that was, with all good intention, deployed by a foundation in the town center or the village center, so that people didn't have to use diesel gen sets. And in that case, the diesel mafia was not happy, so they shut that down. And this really expensive piece of equipment essentially became a charging station for cell phones, which was really a pity because it was providing clean, good quality, much cheaper energy than imported diesel to this remote community. So these are the kinds of questions that I think technology creators in particular need to be mindful of when they're sitting in labs in institutions like this in particular, is what kinds of impacts do these technologies have in the field, and how they change the dynamics between people. So very quickly, based on my survey work, in which I had access to a lot of sales data from about 70 different companies and plugged in the factors that might affect scaling, what was interesting was when you went away, as the further away you moved from a grid, so really getting in the off-grid segment, people had access to fewer kinds of solar technologies, which is a problem because you want people to have more choice for solar technologies the further they are from the grid rather than the closer you are. So a really interesting question around why that's happening, and actually maybe it was because of roads. Who knows? The other thing that really came up was that the more products, and when I say products and product categories, what I'm really saying is a firm that provides a lantern, a solar home lighting system, but also does microgrid services. So the more types of categories a firm has, the more states they're operating in, which is interesting because then that means that there's more learning happening between the policy environments and the financial environments across these states. And then maybe those firms are the ones that are scaling most. So again, the more product categories a firm had actually hindered the number of actual households reached, which maybe is a little intuitive. If you're providing like more than just one particular type of widget, you won't grow as fast. But the chances are you're more invested in providing financing. But the most important finding was that the majority of the firms were operating in areas with grid access. What this means is this whole debate about the role of distributed solar for India will sort of become obsolete as the grid reaches more places is not necessarily true. I mean, it certainly could be questioned, given that most of the firms currently are having business in this space. The next chart is rather complicated. The only thing I want you to know is most of the firms were were doing business outside of the millions that the government was pumping towards subsidies for these products. Why was that? Well, when you have subsidies that can only be utilized by the poor if they have a formal banking account, and when most of your population in that area doesn't have a banking account, you're not going to be able to take advantage of those subsidies. So another really good example of policy design that didn't keep up with the need for financial services and financial access to be able to deploy this technology. More importantly, those firms that were not using subsidies, most of them were offering no financing, and most of them were doing their businesses in pure cash. So again, like serious questions about how to do business with this community and how that solar is being bought. And we need to ask that question of how are people choosing to make that purchasing decision. Finally, the role of networks. And this was really interesting in that the most successful company had this sort of everyone a sales agent model, which I think Amway and one of the makeup companies, maybe it's L'Oreal, where you can sort of get a cut of the commissions if you sell to somebody else. They basically use the same model. And what you had was a bunch of part-time sales agents who got a cut of the commission and were locally, again, embedded in their communities and could be able to close the loop on supply chain and maintenance and servicing, which is so critical for post-diffusion management of these technologies. I also asked for that same company, the customers, the impact that they had on convincing others to be able to purchase the technologies, relatives and friends, and did sort of preliminary mapping of what that looked like. And so that one individual that managed to convince 40 other people was the chief of the village. So you can see sort of the role of social networks and early adopters in trying to diffuse these technologies. All really interesting when you try to do marketing for this new technology in often areas that are not familiar with what its impact will be. And finally, I want to touch upon the fact that these are all the sales of the few informal sales agents that I managed to interview. And you can see that their sales were in the thousands, and they were dealing in pure cash. So the next research question I really think for a lot of academics is, what is the role of these informal sales agents, and what are they really doing, and how are they operating? It'd be really interesting. They're often embedded and really difficult to get to locations, but just important as a study question. All right, so I came back to the US to do the write-up of all of this, and got a job at the Department of Energy on the India desk. And I was charged with managing the bilateral energy partnership, which is one of the most extensive between these two countries. And specifically, I was asked to manage the research portfolio, which has now been augmented. It's more than 100 million, but the initial outlay was 100 million public-private partnership to focus on solar, biofuels, and buildings energy efficiency. And now smart grids and energy storage. And there's a joint IP sharing agreement, which is really unique. But all of this was starting to also influence the global climate negotiations. So if you go back to what happened in 2009, 2010, Copenhagen didn't really lead to anything. So then there was another build-up to, okay, what can we get that's legally binding, or not in this case, that will have substantial impact on the climate? And how can we change the narrative of us versus them to really one where we jointly collaborate and share in the innovation story to address this challenge? And so that was really interesting to sort of manage and follow. And it ultimately influenced India's pledge in the Paris Agreement. So they pledged to reduce their emissions of their GDP by 33 to 35% of 2005 levels by 2030, and to increase their non-fossil share of the power generation capacity by 40%, or 40% by 2030. So that was quite significant, and they had sort of, as you can see, come quite a ways. And what was starting to happen domestically is that India wanted to take a leadership role also in solar. So the twin sort of announcements of mission innovation, the shared vision to double our clean energy R&D really took root, and India at the same time wanted to share all of its experience, which, as you can see, between 2007 and 2014, there was a slew of energy companies in the solar space that really came out of nowhere, or the groundwork was laid for them, but there was tremendous growth, and they wanted to share this story with the rest of the planet and really take a leadership role in how business is done, how these off-grid technologies are deployed. And so that's actually, I'll be curious to see, but by this December, they're hoping that the International Solar Alliance turns into a new intergovernmental organization. So if enough nation states have ratified it, which I think you need 15, it'll become an IGO. And mission innovation, as you heard me say, was a pledge by a select group of countries and economies that you sort of clubbed together to double their clean energy R&D investments. And India is a member of that. But something else happened in 2016, which is that we had elections, which had a pretty tremendous, 2016, getting lost in time here, where we now, it's clear, or it seems clear to some degree, that we're backing out of the Paris Agreement. Some say that we'll still end up meeting our targets anyway, so maybe that's just optics. But if the federal government is not going to be as engaged, what is the role for international collaboration and energy innovation and knowledge sharing and best practices? And that's where the work that I'm doing now, and which really brings me here to Georgia Tech, is to try to find university partners, to find state partners and city partners, and plug them into India's states and cities and universities. Because ultimately, these sub-national partners will really drive an energy innovation ecosystem and help get us, hopefully, as close to as possible to mitigating the impacts of at least not runaway climate change. I don't think we'll be below 2 degrees by any means, but that just means that there's more work to be done together. I think that's all I have.
Questions, comments?
Could you, I would assume that a lot of the, especially the innovation, the entrepreneurs at the bottom of the chain, a lot of them may not be part of the formal legal structure and market and things like that. And there's literature that goes both ways about whether that's good or bad. But certainly there's demand there. Can you talk a little bit about how these businesses may be organized and whether being outside, the ones that are outside of the formal legal structure, whether they benefit from that or whether they would benefit from being incorporated into something more formal?
Well, one of the ways that they're being forced to be a part of the formal system is this new, well, there was a huge effort to essentially take up all the currency that was called demonetization. Essentially, they took all the existing currency and brought it back in, and now there's going to be a huge push for digital payments. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, this was all before that. I'd like to go back and ask how that's impacted them. Because the idea is that will allow for a lot more net gains of taxes for the government, and therefore be able to push a lot more out as well for a variety of different programs. So I think that question's very valid, and I think that demonetization effort is going to end up having probably had a tremendous impact on this community. And in what ways? I don't know that they're going to have to necessarily be legally registered. Again, I haven't tried to unpack what it means for folks in the informal sector. So I don't have a really clear-cut answer for you, but aside from that, they've been pushed into it for sure.
Okay.
Yes?
What is the capacity of this network to maintain the systems and to repair them? One of the issues that's arisen, for example, is periodically USAID gets its all excited about doing deep wells with solar-driven pumps that nobody knows how to maintain. So I was just curious whether this network is resilient in the sense that it has, at the distributed level, the ability to maintain it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way I sort of categorized companies or firms in my research was, there were those that were ecosystem creators, and I think their mission was not just to sell technologies, but to also enable the framework for quality repair and servicing post-deployment, which even the government, through its network of these shops, these public-private partnership shops, couldn't extend its network out far enough to be able to do the repairs and maintenance work. It's been interesting to see the innovation in different states. So for example, an eastern state in India has recently set up a call center. So every single time a solar module or something is sold, there's like a government hotline. So if anything goes wrong, they get notified of it. And so this is allowing them to actually track a lot of data as to which technologies are even better than others, and ultimately might lead some of the firms to get blacklisted by the government to not be eligible for subsidies if they keep getting calls about a particular company's product. The other thing I want to mention is, and this is where USAID has also come in, is they've assisted in the creation of this training program called Surya Mitras, which are essentially solar friends, that is meant to train up an army of solar engineers that can essentially be on call to be able to do maintenance and repairs, kind of like you would call a TV repair person or something like that. So there's actually an app, which I have on my phone, which I can't use here, but you just press the app and you tell you what your address is and location, and somebody shows up. And so they've been training these individuals. So I think the ecosystem for repair and maintenance has gotten tremendously better as a result of this sustained irritant for quite some time, just knowing that is the main issue.
How quickly do you think technology that's developed in university permeates to the grassroots level, and what do you think could be done to improve how to bring it down?
Okay, that's a really good question. I'm going to try to think back to one of the timelines of that company, Greenlight Planet, that I mentioned. So that company's founder, I think, started out in 2005, and ultimately became sort of fiscally sound as a company and had this sort of extensive network by 2013, I want to say. So it takes a little bit of time. And they started out, actually, I remember their story was, they bought a bunch of Home Depot garden lights and tried to sell them to people in India and figure out what the usage would be. So that beta level of testing, and ultimately got to a stage where they had a design team and they have a factory in Shenzhen. And then they ran into the issue of, okay, so we designed this technology, that's great, and we have to get it to the port of Mumbai. And from Mumbai, which is an electrified region and doesn't have need for solar lanterns as much, we have to get it to really far-flung places in a country that has major logistics and transport issues. And what they found was a battery that was fully charged, that I think was lithium ferrophosphate or something like that, in Shenzhen. By the time it got to a person's house, which was 6 months later, and of course when you buy this technology, it's ready, you want to start using it right away. They found that there was deep discharge of the battery and immediately was kind of useless, because once you enter that stage, it almost immediately needs to go for repairs. So then lithium ion came along, and that dramatically improved that scenario, because then that battery could hold charge much longer and wouldn't already be discharged by the time it fuel. So these kinds of things, these learnings, are I think important, and Greenlight Planet's lessons have been sort of taken by other companies as well. So it took quite some time, in several stages of seed funding and winning competitions and the like. But again, that's a whole different model than these informal entrepreneurs who are essentially taking existing technologies and through bulk procurement are bringing down their costs, and then are trying to figure out what's the best package to sell these technologies in. How can I reduce the cost by 50%? By taking a module from one company, a battery from another's. And so it's interesting to sort of study the differences between the two.
Yes?
So you talked a little bit about the sort of equity or the differences. You were talking about age. I'm curious, I've been part of some webinars and looked at some research by the Terry Institute?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where they were looking at women's energy access, and that they've actually found that in some of these rural areas, because they have lighting after dark, now their workday is extended. I'm just curious, did you look at any of those
Yeah, I did.
behavioral changes
Yeah.
that, you know, could actually have, how do you deal with that, the potential negative impacts because of what you're bringing to those communities?
Yeah. One of the questions I asked was how many, how many of your hours are freed up, or how late into the night can you work, and how are you spending that time, and things like, starting a side business. And particularly, some of these companies have targeted shop owners as the consumers for these technologies, because a shop can stay open considerably longer and later into the night than it could before, thereby increasing profits. And if you have a business that you can sell to that has increased profits, they have a chance to be able to pay back their loan much faster. I think there were some cases of sort of side effects, if you will, of okay, so now there's more time to do work. And what does that mean, and the changing dynamics there. So it's a bit of a plus or minus. Are you sort of forced to use that time productively when you might have had some downtime before, after a full day of working in the field or whatever. But at the same time, your kids now have access to lighting to be able to do their studies and their homework.
And I was looking at it from the perspective of education. If you have to work more and you're working more, do you have the education? Are those studies that are being looked at?
Yeah, and I think I think it's called ARC Finance is a group that's created a project that I think they might have just released findings from. It's called the Energy Diaries Project, and they're trying to map this. They tried to do surveys over several months of how people were consuming energy on a daily basis. I think prompt you to sort of check that out and see what their findings were. There's lots of anecdotal evidence on like improved education records and things like that. I collected some myself, but I don't know if I've seen any sort of concrete like having access to electricity does.
Well, it's just so fascinating because it's so different than
Yeah.
what we experience here.
Absolutely.
And so thinking about those kinds of things,
Yeah.
is just curious how many studies are out there.
Yeah, I think a number of people are sort of trying to unpack that. Yes.
You mentioned briefly about how the diesel mafia kind of angry because of this new technology. Did you see any state intervention to assuage or like integrate this new technology smoothly within the community or something?
Yeah, in that particular case, I didn't. It'd be, again, good to sort of follow up and see if that happened. I almost wonder if it would have been an interesting tactic to convince the diesel mafia that should be their new business model rather than selling diesel. They should be the entrepreneurs that should take the loan and create the microgrid for the marketplace. That would be my next sort of approach. I don't know if they'd be open to it, because obviously for diesel, maybe they were charging like really high rates because it is expensive to import to those island places. But again, if they could be convinced, that would be an interesting. That's a really good suggestion, I think. Yes, there.
So I want to follow up a little bit on that, and this goes back to the story you were talking about, the price discrimination that you saw from that owner who had installed a microgrid and then was charging people different prices based on whether it was class or yeah. So in a sphere that is largely unregulated, but is still, even at this distributed model, a monopoly, do you see this kind of exacerbating existing class differences where the wealthy or high power individuals in a rural community are becoming even more entrenched because now they have this technology which they're able to sell at whatever price they might want?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the question that sort of arises from that little bit of anecdotal experience there that I shared with you. I think that it'd be interesting to sort of map out existing ways that power dynamic is already playing out. There may be cases where such wealthy individuals might already have access to like the only irrigation pump in the village or the only other particular service, and this would just be another layer on top of that. And you're right that in an unregulated and unpoliced environment in these places, by deploying this kind of technology, it really is that something that we can control in some way, shape, or form. And I don't know yet that there is a way to control that.
That would be like
So, oh my God, I'm having a senior moment. The question that I had just flipped out of my head. So, please, someone else.
So how do you see students and faculty and others here from Georgia Tech and this region of the country working through what you do in Washington, D.C. and India, getting involved in some of these things?
Great, excellent question. Well, nicely worded there. Well, I'm hoping that we can get students from here to go out and do some field studies in India through the existing programs that you have. And you obviously have excellent faculty members here who are interested in engaging in India, and I would suggest that you take an interest and get out there. And then through our initiative in Washington, again, what we've created essentially, and I've shared this with several people throughout the day today, is essentially create a subnational energy dialogue between the two countries, where we bring in Indian states and U.S. states, and universities can be a part of that process and share their research findings in that platform, and companies can also be a part of that dialogue. And all of that information is then sort of going to be funneled into the bilateral dialogue so that we can really have deep knowledge and share all the great work that's happening from a research perspective with the policymakers, because I feel like often that platform doesn't exist when you're sitting here necessarily or other parts of the country, and Washington kind of does its own thing. And they're often, and that's my role now, is to sort of find out the cool stuff that's happening across the country to bring that back and provide that platform. So that's the aim. And of course, if you're interested in internships at CSIS, we do have those. We're one of the few places that provides paid internships in Washington, D.C. So that's a plug for CSIS. You found your question?
Yeah, I found my question.
Okay.
So with all the time that you spent in the field, what do you think about the role of NGOs in this space? What can be really effective and helpful so that you don't have things like providing the cook stoves that with technology that is not really suited for the use of how people actually live?
Yeah, a really straightforward answer. I think NGOs, some have been really helpful to the development agenda. I think others have probably negatively impacted it, in that when NGOs just decide to go blindly down a particular technology solution route and secure funding and deploy that technology, we sort of don't really help the cause of post-technology management of that technology in the field. And one of the reasons why I think solar hasn't taken off in the way that it should have is because maybe there were too many NGOs that were just sort of doing their own thing, and there's no learning between NGOs often, particularly the small NGOs that sort of proliferate across India. And it's already a very complex ecosystem with different states having their own policies. So I think there's more learning to be had between firms, and I should say firms because some of them could be NGOs that have networks in multiple states, where they can share that amongst each other, what's working where, and share that more broadly, rather than just one NGO doing one small development project. Not to say that it's not important, but certainly I think the inability to share that information might hinder the ability to achieve scale, sustainable scale. Yes.
From your vantage point, would you care to speculate about the fate of the Department of Energy, specifically their energy efficiency and renewable energy division? It's been targeted.
It has. I will say that I think, how to be most diplomatic about this. It has been targeted. I mean, frankly, I think the emphasis is on certain other technologies. That's not to say that there isn't sort of continued focus on innovation and supporting of the national labs, but you're right, the ERA division is sort of being downsized, and I know colleagues that have already transitioned into other offices are not there anymore. And so that's unfortunate, because I think it sends the wrong signal, I think, to partners around the world that we've been collaborating with on critical technologies that can serve as a model, essentially. I mean, this joint IP sharing agreement, public-private partnership, is something that honestly creates jobs on both sides, it's innovative, and has buy-in from the industry. And I think such good projects and models should be sustained. And I'm not one to say that it needs to be, that DOE needs to have its same sort of divisions, but I would hope that some of the core programming that was really innovative and groundbreaking still be sustained. And that the money behind R&D not be stopped. And to that end, the Smart Grids and Energy Storage 5-year funding did get released this June. So that was good to see.
So the merits of their work may garner enough support to keep it going.
Yeah, yeah.
So like, from my experience of India, government and business and citizens usually have a pretty complex relationship that can range from, turning a blind eye to some very effective grassroots interventions. So, especially since you've interacted with people face to face, what do you think the role the government has been, and what do you think it should be in India?
Well, I think since independence, the issue has really been that certain services like electricity have been manipulated by politics. And that is why we have seen in certain parts of India where people feel that electricity is a right that should be free, that makes it really difficult to be able to provide quality services for a resource that probably can't be free because somebody has to pay for it in order to be able to establish that infrastructure and have it be working. So that has really complicated the ability for new things, new innovations and ideas to take root. At the same time, competing government policies, we need to get the grid out to every household. But if we didn't have the grid, before that there was sort of a vacuum and we had entrepreneurs that set up microgrids and decided to create business models. What happens to those, that little bit of infrastructure when the grid comes? So can we create a policy that allows for grid-ready microgrids to really just plug into the central grid, and those people can still get returns on their investment and become maybe mini-grid operators and be part of that sort of maintenance and servicing ecosystem that's really required in billing infrastructure. So I think there's growing sort of acknowledgement that a lot of these interdepartment projects need to be synergized, and the power sector is one area where more and more of that's starting to come up, because we've reached a point where so many cutting-edge technologies are starting to be deployed in India that the government's sort of having to get its act together, if you will. And some states are taking more of a leadership role than others. And those are the ones that, frankly, we're interested in providing Georgia Tech and others as partners.
Yeah. So you mentioned the work that you're doing currently is mostly Track 1.5 or Track 2 diplomacy, right? And so do you have any concrete deliverables that are with timelines that are supposed to come out?
Well, timeline's a little bit tricky, as this is the first time somebody's putting together a sort of extensive bilateral subnational Track 1.5 dialogue. And but I think deliverables would be, say if a particular government department in India is interested in creating an R&D center, can we find them the right research institute and private sector to be able to make that, private sector partner to be able to realize that and use that as a model to have it happen in other parts of the country? Can we provide a research institution as a partner to a government that wants to do evaluation of their new solar irrigation pumps that they're deploying in the tens of thousands across their state? What data can they collect from that to be able to inform more rollout? So those kinds of partnerships would sort of be deliverables. And technology is actually being deployed into the field, and particularly in the power sector.
You mentioned also about the notion of energy poverty.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's tend to be, intuitively that's tend to be in the rural areas. But did you see like the same notion happen in urban areas, particularly with, those residents that live in informal settlements?
Absolutely, yes. I didn't touch on that at all, but some of the firms that I was looking at actually deal with energy access in urban environments, because and in places like Mumbai and Bangalore, you'll have these gleaming high-rises, but really, really close to them, you'll have slum areas which don't have good connections to water resources, and certainly not electricity. And so there are certain business models that have come up, again, around the smaller scale solutions to be able to get access to people to for lighting and cell phone charging, because obviously in an urban environment and in a rural environment, tons of people, I think more than half the population has access to phones, and I think something like 200 million people have access to smartphones. So that's a growing segment of the population. So yes, there is an active need for energy access even in the urban environment, sadly. Yes.
You were talking about the microgrids being able to connect in like an ideal world with the main grid, and it reminded me of one of your articles where you were talking about an entrepreneur selling solar power, solar home lighting systems, and he was kind of caught off guard with his business when the grid reached his zone. Does the government kind of like announce a plan where they're going next with the grid so that these entrepreneurs can react accordingly?
Sometimes. I mean, I actually haven't had to look into that too much. I imagine that people have there's probably some pre-survey work that is done by the transmission companies that come around home to home to sort of look at and evaluate which homes need connections. So there's probably a sense of, yes, the grid is going to be coming here soon. How much time after that initial survey work, like that one person might have checked off their box, but actually getting the wires out, I don't think there's a sense that community necessarily knows how long that will take. I will add that there's a whole new level of transparency in terms of sharing information and data in the power sector in India that did not exist when I was doing my research. So if you go to the Ministry of Power's website, they've created all these dashboards and portals where they're tracking how many villages, they've got like a countdown clock essentially of how many villages are left unelectrified, at the district level, at the village level, sorry, and also, you know, who's the person responsible with their cell phone number on this public website. So you have access to that level of detail. Of course, even with this transparency, it's been shown more recently that some of the villages that were deemed electrified, when there was some sort of investigation done into it, they found out that a few of the villages actually weren't. So quality of data is always to be questioned, but the fact that there are all these portals and things is kind of great.
What's that picture?
So this picture is a lady who is in an informal settlement in a tribal village in the state of Rajasthan, which is also where I'm from. And that hanging to the top right is a LED-based, that's an LED bulb that's connected to a solar panel on her roof. And this is actually one of the first LED solar home lighting distribution examples in India. So this was in 2000. This was done in 2005. I went in 2007 to evaluate what happened to this community, because at that time, LEDs were not being manufactured in India. They were actually very hard to even, you wouldn't be able to buy a LED bulb at that time in India really readily. So I wanted to evaluate what would happen 2 years on. And there were 36 diodes in these bulbs. And so what I found was, even after 2 years without ability to replace these bulbs, as diode after diode essentially broke, there were people that were still using these systems with just one diode working. And that rats had chewed through wires, monkeys had thrown the panels off roofs. Like, these are the kinds of things that these people were dealing with. People were, bringing their whole, the bulb with the wire and the battery out to the field because they wanted portability. And so we captured all this information in a case study for this group called Grameen Surya Bijli, which I don't know if it still exists, and shared that widely. And ultimately, it was picked up by a company that at the time was a startup called D-Light Design, which is now known globally, and I think has like some significant share of the world's electrified population that they serve through the variety of their products. They essentially designed something that looks like an Nalgene bottle that had one diode in it and was unbreakable because it could just like fall on the ground, and had a thin film solar panel on top. And so, that's the kind of findings that could be incorporated into technology design, and then they're a hugely successful firm now that's gone into microgrids and solar home lighting systems.
Is that a stove?
It's a little closet that is earthen.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one.
Well, thank you.
No? Okay, well, please join me in thanking